Dorothy Miller's hands shook as she held a small white card. The sewing box sat on her kitchen table, identical to the one her husband Walter had owned for 53 years. The same dark cherry wood, the same brass hinges, the same tiny scratch on the upper right corner. But Walter had been dead for 5 years. And this box had just arrived at her door. The card in her trembling fingers had only 7 words written in handwriting she didn't recognize. He wanted you to know the truth. Dorothy's heart pounded in her chest. Her mouth went dry. She looked at the closed sewing box, then back at the card, then at the box again. What truth? What had Walter kept from her? Her finger moved toward the small brass latch on the front of the box. Then she stopped, because suddenly Dorothy wasn't sure she wanted to know. Let's go back to where this all started. 3 hours earlier, Dorothy Miller woke up that Tuesday morning the same way she had woken up every morning for the past 5 years. Alone. The house was quiet. Too quiet. She could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, counting down the seconds of her life like it had nothing better to do. She was 81 years old. Her silver hair was thin now, tied back in a simple bun. Her hands were wrinkled and spotted with age. Her knees hurt when she climbed stairs. But her mind was still sharp as a tack, as her mother used to say. Dorothy made herself a cup of coffee in the small kitchen of her home in Cedar Falls, Iowa. It was the same house she and Walter had bought in 1968, right after they got married. The same house where they raised their daughter, Susan. The same house where Walter had his heart attack in the living room on a cold January morning 5 years ago. She sat at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the bird feeder in the backyard. A red cardinal landed on it and started pecking at the seeds. "Good morning, little friend," Dorothy whispered to the bird. The bird didn't answer. Birds never did. But Dorothy talked to them anyway. She talked to a lot of things these days. The birds, the flowers in her garden, the pictures of Walter on the walls, architected protagonist backstory, and plotted inciting incident reveal. Good start. I'm establishing Dorothy as the protagonist, her age, her loneliness, and the setting. Now I need to build up to the inciting incident, finding Walter's old sewing box in the attic, which will make the arrival of the mysterious identical box even more shocking. Let me continue building the tension. Sometimes she even talked to Walter, even though he couldn't hear her anymore. After breakfast, Dorothy decided to do something she had been avoiding for 5 years. She was going to clean out the attic. Susan, her daughter, had been asking her to do it for years now. "Mom, you need to go through Dad's things," Susan would say during their weekly phone calls. "You can't keep them up there forever." But Dorothy could, and she had. Because going through Walter's things meant accepting that he was really gone. And even after 5 years, that was still hard to accept. But today felt different. Today, Dorothy woke up with a strange feeling in her chest, like something was about to happen. Something big. She climbed the stairs slowly, holding onto the railing. Her knees complained with each step. When she reached the second floor, she pulled down the attic ladder and climbed up into the dusty space above. The attic smelled like old wood and forgotten memories. Boxes were stacked everywhere. Dorothy had labeled them years ago. Christmas decorations, Susan's baby clothes, old tax papers, and in the far corner, covered with an old white sheet, were Walter's things. Dorothy walked over slowly. Her heart beat faster. She pulled the sheet off and saw 3 large boxes, all marked with Walter in her own handwriting. She opened the first box. Inside were his old work shirts from the factory where he had worked for 30 years. She pulled one out and held it to her face. It didn't smell like him anymore. It just smelled like cardboard and time. The second box had his tools. Walter loved fixing things around the house. He could fix anything: leaky faucets, broken lamps, squeaky doors. "Why pay someone when I can do it myself?" he always said, with that crooked smile of his. Dorothy felt tears forming in her eyes. She missed that smile. Then she opened the third box. And there it was, Walter's old sewing box. Dorothy gasped. She had completely forgotten about it. It was made of dark cherry wood with brass hinges and a small brass latch on the front. Walter had inherited it from his mother when she died back in 1975. He kept it on his workbench in the garage for years, using it to store buttons, needles, and thread for when he needed to fix a shirt or sew a patch on his work pants. But there was something else about this box. Something Dorothy had always wondered about but never asked. Walter was very protective of it. He never let Dorothy organize it, never let her clean it out. Whenever she offered to help, he would smile and say, "No, honey, I've got my own system. I know where everything is." It seemed strange at the time, but Dorothy never pushed it. Everyone had their little quirks, right? Everyone had something that was just theirs. She lifted the sewing box out of the cardboard box. It was heavier than she remembered. She set it on an old trunk and stared at it. The tiny scratch on the upper right corner was still there. Walter had made that scratch in 1982 when he dropped the box in the garage. He felt so bad about it, like he had damaged something precious. Dorothy's finger traced the scratch gently. Should she open it? It felt wrong somehow, like she was invading Walter's privacy. But Walter was gone. And this was just a sewing box with old buttons and thread, right? Before she could decide, she heard the doorbell ring downstairs. Dorothy frowned. She wasn't expecting anyone. Susan lived 3 states away in Oregon and only visited during holidays. The mailman never rang the bell, and Dorothy didn't have many friends left. Most of them had either moved away or passed on. She carefully made her way down the attic ladder, then down the stairs to the first floor. Her knees were really complaining now. Through the frosted glass of her front door, she could see a shape, someone standing on her porch. Dorothy opened the door. A young man stood there, maybe 30 years old, wearing a brown delivery uniform. He held a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Dorothy Miller?" he asked. "Yes, that's me," Dorothy said. "I have a delivery for you. I just need a signature." Dorothy signed the electronic pad the man held out. He handed her the package and walked back to his truck. Dorothy closed the door and looked at the package. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox. It was surprisingly heavy. There was no return address, just her name and address written in neat handwriting. She carried it to the kitchen table and sat down. Using a pair of scissors, she carefully cut the tape and unwrapped the brown paper. And then she froze. Inside was a wooden box, dark cherry wood, brass hinges, a small brass latch on the front, and in the upper right corner, a tiny scratch. Dorothy's blood ran cold. It was identical to Walter's sewing box. Completely identical. But how? Why? Her hands shaking, she noticed a small white card resting on top of the box. She picked it up. In handwriting she didn't recognize, 7 words were written. "He wanted you to know the truth." Dorothy felt like the room was spinning. She gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. What truth? What was this? She looked at the sewing box sitting in front of her. Then she remembered. Walter's original sewing box was still upstairs in the attic, exactly where she had left it. 2 identical boxes. One from her dead husband's past. One arriving mysteriously at her door 53 years later. Dorothy's mind raced with questions. Who sent this? How did they get an identical box? What truth was Walter keeping from her? Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. For 5 years, she had mourned her husband. For 5 years, she had believed she knew everything about him, about their life together. But this box suggested otherwise. Dorothy reached for the brass latch. Her fingers trembled as they touched the cold metal. She had 2 choices. She could open the box and discover whatever truth Walter had hidden from her for 53 years. Or she could throw it away, never open it, and go on believing her marriage had been exactly what she thought it was. But Dorothy had never been someone who ran from the truth, even when it scared her. She took a deep breath. and she opened the box. Inside, she found letters. Dozens of them. Old, yellowed envelopes stacked neatly on top of each other, tied together with a faded red ribbon. Dorothy picked up the stack with shaking hands. The top envelope had a name written on it in Walter's handwriting. Handwriting she would recognize anywhere. But the name on the envelope wasn't hers. The name was Margaret. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. Margaret! Who was Margaret? She untied the ribbon with trembling fingers and pulled out the first envelope. Inside was a letter, dated June 15th, 1971, just 3 years after she and Walter got married. Dorothy began to read. My dearest Margaret, I can't stop thinking about you. Every day that passes, I wonder what you're doing, if you're happy, if you ever think about me the way I think about you. I know I made my choice. I know I chose a different life. But that doesn't mean… Dorothy couldn't read anymore. The letter fell from her hands onto the table. Walter had written love letters to someone named Margaret while he was married to her. Her whole body went numb. 53 years of marriage, 53 years of believing Walter loved only her, 53 years of trust. And it had all been a lie? Dorothy's eyes filled with tears, but they didn't fall. She was too shocked to cry. She looked at the stack of letters. There were at least 30 of them, maybe more, all addressed to Margaret, all in Walter's handwriting. Who was this woman? When did Walter know her? Why did he write her these letters? And the biggest question of all, why was someone sending these to Dorothy now, 5 years after Walter's death? Dorothy picked up another letter from the stack. This one was dated September 3rd, 1972. Her hands shook as she opened it. Margaret, I saw you today at the grocery store. You didn't see me. You were with your husband and your little boy. He must be about 3 years old now. He has your eyes. I wanted to say hello. I wanted to talk to you, to hear your voice again. But I couldn't. Dorothy was with me, and I couldn't… Dorothy gasped. Walter had seen this Margaret woman. He had watched her with her family. He had wanted to talk to her, all while Dorothy stood beside him, completely unaware. She felt sick to her stomach. Dorothy pushed the letters away and stood up from the table. She needed air. She needed space. She needed to think. But her mind wouldn't stop racing. Who was Margaret? An old girlfriend? A woman Walter loved before he met Dorothy? Or worse, someone he loved while he was married to Dorothy? And why did these letters exist? Why did Walter write them but never send them? Because looking at the envelopes again, Dorothy realized something. They were sealed. Every single one of them was still sealed. Walter had written these letters to Margaret, but he had never sent them. Why? Dorothy paced around her kitchen, her heart pounding, her mind spinning with questions and hurt and confusion. She had been married to Walter for 53 years. She thought she knew him. She thought their love was simple and true and honest. But these letters suggested something else entirely. Dorothy stopped pacing and looked at the sewing box again, at the stack of letters sitting beside it. There were dozens more letters she hadn't read yet, dozens more secrets waiting to be discovered. And somewhere out there, someone knew about these letters. Someone had taken the time to find an identical sewing box, place these letters inside, and send them to Dorothy's door. But who? And why now? Dorothy picked up the small white card again and read the 7 words one more time. He wanted you to know the truth. Her jaw tightened. Her hands stopped shaking. The tears in her eyes dried up. If there was a truth to know, then Dorothy was going to find it. She sat back down at the table, pulled the stack of letters toward her, and picked up the next one in the pile. This one was dated December 24th, 1973, Christmas Eve. Dorothy opened it and began to read. Margaret, it's Christmas Eve, and I'm sitting in my garage while Dorothy wraps presents inside the house. She's humming Christmas carols. She's so happy. And I'm out here, writing to you again, thinking about the Christmas we spent together all those years ago. Do you remember the snow? Do you remember how we walked through town looking at all the lights? Do you remember what you said to me that night? You said, No matter what happens, no matter where life takes us, you'll always be the one, Walter. But I'm not the one. I'm Dorothy's husband. I'm the father of a little girl who thinks I'm a hero. I'm a factory worker who comes home tired every night to a wife who deserves better than a man who can't stop thinking about someone else. I'm sorry, Margaret. I'm sorry I couldn't be what you needed. I'm sorry I made the choice I made. But most of all, I'm sorry that I can't forget you. Merry Christmas, Walter. Dorothy's hands clenched the letter so tightly it crumpled. Walter had spent Christmas Eve in the garage, writing love letters to another woman while Dorothy was inside their home, happy and oblivious, wrapping presents for their daughter. How many other holidays had been like this? How many birthdays, anniversaries, ordinary Tuesday nights had Walter spent thinking about Margaret instead of being present with Dorothy? She felt betrayed, angry, heartbroken, but she also felt something else, something she didn't expect, curiosity. Because despite the pain these letters were causing, Dorothy needed to know the whole story. She needed to understand who Margaret was and what she had meant to Walter. She needed to understand the man she had spent her entire adult life with. Dorothy reached for another letter, but just as her fingers touched the envelope, she heard a sound that made her freeze. A knock at the back door. Dorothy's head snapped up. No one used her back door. Ever. It led to her backyard, which was fenced in and private. The knock came again. 3 sharp raps. Dorothy's heart started pounding for a different reason now. Who was at her back door? Was it the person who sent the box? She stood up slowly and walked toward the back of the house. Through the small window in the door, she could see a shadow of someone standing there. Dorothy's hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. She unlocked it and pulled the door open. Standing on her back porch was a woman. She looked to be in her early 80s, with white hair and sad, tired eyes. And when the woman spoke, her voice was soft and filled with regret. "Hello, Dorothy," she said. "My name is Margaret. I think it's time we finally met." Dorothy couldn't move. She stood in the doorway, staring at the woman on her back porch. Margaret, the name from the letters. The woman Walter had loved, or maybe still loved, even while he was married to Dorothy. Margaret looked just as old as Dorothy. Her white hair was pulled back into a bun, just like Dorothy's. Her face had wrinkles and age spots. Her eyes were a pale blue, and they looked sad. So very sad. "I know this is a shock," Margaret said quietly. "May I come in? Please? I promise I'll explain everything." Dorothy's mouth was dry. Her mind was spinning. 1,000 questions fought to get out all at once, but only one word came out. "Why?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Because Walter asked me to. Before he died, he made me promise that when the time was right, I would tell you the truth. And today felt like the right time." Dorothy's hands tightened on the doorframe. You were with him before he died? You knew my husband was dying and you didn't tell me?" No, Margaret said quickly, shaking her head. "Not like that. Please, Dorothy, let me come in. Let me explain. I owe you that much." Dorothy didn't want to let her in. She wanted to slam the door in Margaret's face. She wanted to scream and cry and demand answers. But she also needed to know the truth. She stepped aside and let Margaret enter. The 2 women sat across from each other at Dorothy's kitchen table. The sewing box with the letters sat between them like a wall of secrets. Margaret looked at the box and then at Dorothy. "You opened it," she said softly. "Of course I opened it," Dorothy said, her voice harder than she meant it to be. "Someone sends me a mysterious package with letters from my dead husband to another woman. What did you expect?" "I expected you to be angry," Margaret said. "I expected you to hate me. I wouldn't blame you if you did." Dorothy crossed her arms. "Who are you? How did you know Walter? And why did he write you all those letters?" Margaret took a deep breath. Her hands trembled as she folded them in her lap. Walter and I grew up together in Cedar Falls, Margaret began. We lived on the same street. We went to the same schools. We were best friends from the time we were 7 years old. Dorothy felt a cold chill run down her spine. Walter had never mentioned a childhood best friend named Margaret. Not once in 53 years. Margaret continued. When we were 16, we fell in love. Young love, you know? The kind that feels like it's going to last forever. We used to sneak out at night and meet by the river. We'd talk about our dreams, our futures. Walter wanted to be an engineer. I wanted to be a teacher. She paused, her eyes distant, remembering. When we graduated high school in 1960, we made plans. We were going to get married. Walter was going to go to college, and I was going to work to help pay for it. We had it all figured out. So what happened? Dorothy asked, even though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Margaret's face crumpled with sadness. Life happened. Walter's father died suddenly that summer. Heart attack. Walter was the oldest of 4 kids, and his mother couldn't work because she had to take care of the younger children. The family needed money desperately. Dorothy felt her chest tighten. Walter had told her about his father's death, but he'd always made it sound like it happened when he was much younger. Walter couldn't go to college anymore, Margaret said. He had to get a job at the factory to support his family. And I understood. I really did. But our plans changed. Everything changed. Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. We tried to make it work for 2 more years. But Walter was working 12-hour shifts at the factory. He was exhausted all the time. He was angry that his dreams had died. And I was trying to go to college by myself, and it was hard. We started fighting. About everything. About nothing. And then, one day, Walter said maybe we should take a break. Just for a little while. Just until things got better. Dorothy's hands clenched in her lap. She could see where this was going. I met someone else during that break, Margaret whispered. His name was Robert. He was kind and stable and wanted the same things I wanted. And when Walter found out, he was devastated. He said I had betrayed him. He said I had given up on us. But you had both agreed to take a break, Dorothy said, confused. I know, Margaret said, more tears falling now. But Walter didn't mean it that way. He thought a break meant we would work on ourselves separately and then come back together. But I thought it meant we were free to see other people. Margaret looked down at her hands. It was a misunderstanding that destroyed everything. Walter was so hurt, he told me he never wanted to see me again. And I was too proud to fight for him. So I married Robert in 1964. Dorothy felt her stomach twist. And Walter met me in 1967. Margaret nodded. Yes. But Dorothy, you need to understand something. Walter did love you. He really did. Don't, Dorothy said sharply. Don't tell me he loved me when he spent our entire marriage writing secret letters to you, orchestrated emotional escalation, and foreshadowed narrative revelations ahead. Good. I'm maintaining the tension and emotion. Dorothy is rightfully angry, and Margaret is trying to explain. I need to continue building this scene, revealing more but not everything yet. I should add more details about Walter's relationship with both women and work toward another shocking revelation at the end of this chapter. That's what I need to explain, Margaret said urgently. Those letters, Walter never sent them to me. I never knew they existed until 2 months ago. Dorothy froze. What? 2 months ago, I received a phone call, Margaret said, from a lawyer. He said he represented Walter Miller's estate and that Walter had left something for me in his will, something he wanted me to have after he died. Dorothy's mind reeled. Walter left you something in his will? That's impossible. I would have known. It was a small clause that the lawyer kept private, as Walter requested, Margaret said. All it said was that 5 years after Walter's death, the lawyer should contact me and give me a package. The package contained that sewing box and all those letters. Dorothy stared at the box on the table. Why? Why would Walter do that? Margaret's voice broke. Because he wanted me to read them. And then he wanted me to bring them to you. He wanted both of us to know the truth. What truth? Dorothy demanded. That he loved you? That he married me, but never stopped thinking about you? I already figured that out from the letters. No, Margaret said firmly. That's not the truth at all. She reached across the table and picked up the stack of letters. Dorothy, have you read all of these? No. I only read 3 before you showed up. Margaret nodded. Then you haven't gotten to the important ones yet. She shuffled through the stack and pulled out a letter near the bottom. The envelope was dated March 10th, 1985. Read this one, Margaret said, sliding it across the table to Dorothy. Dorothy's hands shook as she picked up the envelope. Why was Margaret so insistent that she read this particular letter? She opened it and began to read. Margaret, I've been writing these letters to you for 14 years now. 14 years of pouring my heart out to someone who will never read these words. 14 years of holding on to something that doesn't exist anymore. And I've realized something. I need to stop. Not because I don't care about you anymore, not because I've forgotten what we had, but because I've finally understood what I've been doing wrong all this time. I've been living in the past. I've been so focused on what I lost, on what we lost, that I haven't been fully present for what I have. Dorothy is a good woman. No, she's more than that. She's an amazing woman. She's patient and kind and loving. She takes care of me when I'm sick. She laughs at my terrible jokes. She believes in me even when I don't believe in myself. And our daughter, Susan, she's the best thing that ever happened to me. She's smart and funny and has your eyes, Margaret. Not your actual eyes, but the way your eyes used to look when you believed in something. Full of hope. For 14 years, I've been writing to you because I thought I needed closure. I thought I needed to process what happened between us. But the truth is, I've been using these letters as an excuse. An excuse not to fully commit to my life. An excuse not to give Dorothy everything she deserves. That ends today. This is my last letter to you, Margaret. I'm going to put all these letters in my mother's old sewing box, and I'm going to lock them away. Not because I'm ashamed of them, but because they represent a version of me that doesn't exist anymore. I hope you're happy, wherever you are. I hope Robert treats you well. I hope you got to be that teacher you always wanted to be. But most of all, I hope you've let go of the past, just like I'm doing right now. Goodbye, Margaret. Walter. Dorothy finished reading and looked up at Margaret with tears in her eyes. He stopped, Dorothy whispered. He stopped writing to you. Margaret nodded, her own tears flowing freely now. Yes, that was his last letter, and he kept his word. There are no letters after that date. Dorothy felt something crack open inside her chest. A little bit of the hurt started to ease. But there's more, Margaret said gently. She reached into her purse and pulled out another envelope. This one was crisp and new. This letter wasn't in the sewing box. It was separate. The lawyer gave it to me with instructions to read it first, before I read any of the old letters. She handed it to Dorothy. This one is addressed to both of us. Dorothy took the envelope with shaking hands. It had both their names written on it, Dorothy and Margaret. She opened it and found a letter dated December 2019, just 1 month before Walter died. Dorothy began to read out loud. Dear Dorothy and Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm gone. And you're probably both very confused and maybe very angry with me. Dorothy, my darling wife, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for the secrets I kept. I'm sorry for the letters I wrote to another woman during our marriage. I'm sorry for not being completely honest with you about my past. But I need you to know something. Those letters I wrote to Margaret, they were never meant to hurt you. They were my way of working through old pain and old regrets. They were my therapy before I knew what therapy was. And I stopped writing them in 1985, as you'll see if you read through all of them. For the last 34 years of our marriage, I never once wrote another letter to Margaret. I never once looked back with longing, because I finally understood that my past with Margaret was just that, the past. You were my present and my future, Dorothy. You were my home. Margaret, I'm sorry too. I'm sorry I blamed you for moving on. I'm sorry I was too young and too stupid to understand that sometimes people grow apart, and that's nobody's fault. The truth is, you and Robert were meant to be together, and Dorothy and I were meant to be together. I believe that now, but I also believe that both of you deserve to know the whole truth before I died. You deserve to know that I wasn't perfect, that I struggled, that I made mistakes. Dorothy, I want you to meet Margaret. I want you two to talk. Because Margaret can tell you stories about me when I was young, stories I never told you because I was too proud or too ashamed. And Margaret, I want you to hear from Dorothy about the man I became, about the husband and father I worked so hard to be. I think if you two meet, you'll discover something important. You'll discover that you're not enemies, you're not rivals. You're two women who both knew different versions of the same man. And maybe, just maybe, you can help each other remember me the way I should be remembered, not as perfect, but as someone who tried his best to love well. I love you both, in different ways, and for different reasons, and I hope you can forgive me for waiting until I was gone to tell you the truth. With all my heart, Walter. Dorothy finished reading and set the letter down on the table. Tears streamed down her face. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. They just sat there, crying quietly, grieving together. Finally, Margaret broke the silence. He was a good man, Dorothy. Not perfect, but good. Dorothy wiped her eyes. Did you love him? When you were young? Yes, Margaret said without hesitation. I loved him very much. But I also loved Robert. I know that sounds impossible, but it's true. I loved them differently. Are you still married to Robert? Dorothy asked. Margaret's face fell. No, he passed away 3 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry, Dorothy said, and she meant it. Thank you, Margaret said. Dorothy, I know this is all very strange and uncomfortable, but Walter was right. I think we should talk. I think we should share our stories about him. Not to compare or compete, but to understand the whole picture of who he was. Dorothy looked at the woman sitting across from her, the woman Walter had loved before her, the woman who had been part of Walter's past. And for the first time since opening the sewing box, Dorothy felt something other than anger and hurt. She felt curious. Tell me about young Walter, Dorothy said slowly. What was he like before life got hard? Margaret smiled through her tears. Oh, he was wonderful. He was funny and brave and full of dreams. He wanted to change the world, you know. He wanted to build bridges and skyscrapers and things that would last forever. He never told me that, Dorothy said quietly. He probably forgot, Margaret said. After his father died and he had to give up college, I think he buried those dreams deep down. It was too painful to remember them. For the next 2 hours, Margaret told Dorothy stories about Walter as a boy and a young man. Stories about pranks he played in school. Stories about the time he rescued a dog from a frozen pond. Stories about his dreams and hopes and the person he was before the world broke his heart. And Dorothy listened, fascinated, discovering parts of her husband she had never known existed. But then Margaret said something that made Dorothy's blood run cold. Dorothy, there's one more thing Walter wanted me to tell you. Something he couldn't put in the letter. Dorothy's heart started pounding again. What? Margaret hesitated, her face troubled. The lawyer gave me something else along with the letters. Walter left specific instructions that I should give it to you only after we had talked, and only if I thought you were ready to know. Know what? Dorothy asked, her voice rising with anxiety. Margaret reached into her purse again and pulled out a small old photograph. She placed it face down on the table between them. This photograph was hidden at the very bottom of the sewing box, Margaret said quietly. Walter kept it separate from the letters. I don't think he looked at it very often, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy it either. Dorothy stared at the back of the photograph. Her hands trembled. What is it? She whispered. Margaret's eyes were filled with sorrow. It's the reason Walter could never completely let go of the past. And it's the reason he wanted us to meet before you saw this. She slowly turned the photograph over. Dorothy gasped. The photograph showed a young Walter and a young Margaret, both around 16 years old. They were standing by a river, smiling at the camera, with their arms around each other. But that wasn't what made Dorothy gasp. Between them, held gently in Margaret's arms, was a baby, a tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Dorothy's voice was barely a whisper. "Margaret, who is that baby?" Margaret's face crumpled, and she began to cry. "His name was Thomas. He was our son." The room started spinning. Dorothy gripped the edge of the table. Your son?" Dorothy repeated. "You and Walter had a son?" "Yes," Margaret sobbed. "But he died, Dorothy. He died when he was only 3 months old. Sudden infant death syndrome. It happened 2 months before Walter's father died. It was why Walter and I were already falling apart before his father's death pushed us over the edge." Dorothy couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Walter had a son who died, a son he never told her about. "Why didn't he tell me?" Dorothy cried out. "Why did he keep this from me for 53 years? Margaret shook her head. "Because the pain was too much. Because he buried it so deep that I think he convinced himself it never happened. Because when we lost Thomas, we lost everything, our love, our future, our hope, and Walter couldn't face it." Dorothy stared at the photograph of the baby, Walter's son, and felt her entire understanding of her husband shatter into pieces. How much more did she not know? How many other secrets had Walter taken to his grave? And then Margaret said the words that changed everything. "Dorothy, there's something else. Thomas isn't the only secret Walter kept about children." Dorothy's head snapped up. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a deep breath, her hands shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. 2 weeks ago, a man came to my house. He was in his 50s. He said his name was David Miller, and he had been searching for his biological father his entire life." Dorothy felt the room tilt. "David told me that his mother was a woman named Patricia who worked at the factory with Walter in the early 1970s. She got pregnant, but Walter didn't know. Patricia quit her job and moved to another state before she started showing. She never told Walter about the baby." "No," Dorothy whispered. "No, that can't be true. Patricia died last year," Margaret continued. "Before she died, she told David the truth about his father. She gave him Walter's name. David has been searching for Walter ever since. But when he found out Walter died 5 years ago, he tracked down Walter's family instead." Margaret looked directly into Dorothy's eyes. "Dorothy, David is coming here. He'll be knocking on your door in about 5 minutes. And he wants to meet you, his father's wife. He wants to know about the man who never knew he existed." Just as Margaret finished speaking, there was a knock on the front door. 3 firm knocks. Dorothy stood up from the table, her legs shaking, her heart racing. Behind that door was a man who claimed to be Walter's son, a son from an affair Walter had during their marriage. A son who would force Dorothy to face the possibility that Walter had kept even darker secrets than she ever imagined. She walked slowly to the front door, her hand reaching for the doorknob. And as she opened it, she came face to face with a man who had Walter's eyes, Walter's nose, and Walter's crooked smile. "Mrs. Miller?" the man said. "I'm David. I think I'm your husband's son." David Miller stood in Dorothy's doorway, and the resemblance was undeniable. He had Walter's dark brown eyes. He had Walter's strong jaw. He even had that same crooked smile that Dorothy had fallen in love with 53 years ago. But this man, this stranger, was not her husband. He was evidence of a betrayal Dorothy never knew existed. "Please," David said softly, "I know this is a shock. But I've been searching for the truth about my father for 30 years. I just want to talk." Dorothy couldn't speak. She couldn't move. She just stared at this man who looked so much like Walter, it made her chest ache. Behind her, Margaret's voice broke the silence. "Dorothy, let him in. We need to hear his story." Dorothy finally found her voice. "You knew about this? You knew there was another son?" "I only found out 2 weeks ago," Margaret said, coming to stand beside Dorothy. "David contacted me first because he thought I might know how to reach you. I told him to wait until today, until after you opened the sewing box and we had a chance to talk." Dorothy felt betrayed all over again. "You should have warned me." "I know," Margaret said gently, "but Walter wanted it this way. He wanted you to understand the context before you met David. He wanted you to know about his past, about Thomas, about the pain he carried, so that when you learned about David, you might be able to understand." "Understand?" Dorothy's voice cracked. "Understand that my husband cheated on me? Understand that he had a whole other child he never told me about?" "Please," David said again, his voice pleading. "It wasn't like that. My mother, she never told him. He didn't know I existed." Dorothy looked at David, really looked at him. He was wearing a simple blue button-down shirt and jeans. His hair was graying at the temples. He had kind eyes, sad eyes. Eyes that had been searching for answers his whole life. Against every instinct screaming at her to slam the door, Dorothy stepped aside. "Come in," she said quietly. The three of them sat in Dorothy's living room. Dorothy sat in Walter's old armchair, the one he used to read the newspaper in every morning. Margaret sat on the couch, and David sat across from them in a wooden chair, his hands clasped nervously in his lap. "Tell me everything," Dorothy said. Her voice was hard, but her eyes were filling with tears. "Tell me about this woman Patricia and how my husband betrayed me." David flinched at the word betrayed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old photograph. He handed it to Dorothy. The photograph showed a young woman with dark hair and a bright smile. She was wearing a factory uniform. "This is my mother, Patricia Chen," David said. "She worked at Cedar Falls Manufacturing from 1970 to 1972. That's where she met Walter." Dorothy stared at the photograph. The woman was beautiful, young, full of life. Did he have an affair with her?" Dorothy asked, her voice breaking. "No," David said firmly. "At least, not the way you're thinking." He pulled out another piece of paper, this time a letter, yellowed with age. "Before my mother died last year, she wrote me this letter. She knew she didn't have much time left, and she wanted me to know the truth about my father. She made me promise not to search for him until after she was gone." "Why?" Margaret asked. "Because she was ashamed," David said quietly. "Because what happened between her and Walter wasn't an affair. It was one night. One terrible, complicated night." Dorothy's hands clenched the arms of Walter's chair. "Tell me." David took a deep breath. "It was December 1971. According to my mother's letter, she and Walter were both working the night shift at the factory. It was 2 weeks before Christmas. Walter had just gotten into a huge fight with you, Mrs. Miller. Do you remember?" Dorothy's mind raced back to December 1971, 53 years ago. And then, suddenly, she did remember. It was the year Susan was 3 years old. Dorothy had wanted to spend money on Christmas presents and a nice dinner, but Walter had insisted they needed to save every penny because his mother was sick and needed help with medical bills. They had fought. Badly. Walter had stormed out of the house, saying he needed to clear his head. He didn't come home until the next morning. Dorothy had assumed he'd gone to a bar or driven around all night. But now... "He went to work," Dorothy whispered. "He went to the factory." David nodded. "My mother said he was devastated. He was crying in the break room. She tried to comfort him. She said they talked for hours about life and marriage and how hard everything was." He paused, his face full of sorrow. And then they made a mistake. A terrible mistake that they both regretted immediately. Dorothy felt like she was going to be sick. My mother said Walter was so upset afterward, David continued. He told her it should never have happened. He loved his wife. He loved his daughter. He had just been in a dark place, and he'd made a horrible choice. And your mother? Margaret asked gently. She felt the same way, David said. She was ashamed. She wanted to forget it ever happened. They both agreed never to speak of it again. They avoided each other at the factory. They pretended it never happened. But then she got pregnant, Dorothy said, her voice hollow. Yes, David said. She didn't realize it until January. By then, she knew she couldn't tell Walter. She knew it would destroy his marriage. She knew it would ruin his life. So she quit her job, packed her bags, and moved to California. She told the factory she was going to care for a sick relative. Dorothy stared at the photograph of Patricia. She never told him. Never, David confirmed. She raised me by herself. She worked 2 jobs to support us. She never married. She never even dated. I think she carried the guilt of that one night for her entire life. Tears streamed down Dorothy's face. Walter never knew. He never knew he had another son. No, David said softly. And when I was growing up, my mother told me my father had died before I was born. She said he was a good man who would have loved me if he'd had the chance. She never told me his name. She said it was too painful. So how did you find out? Margaret asked. Last year, when my mother was dying, she finally told me the truth, David said. She said she couldn't die with this secret. She said I deserved to know who my father was, but she made me promise to wait until after she passed, before I tried to find him. David pulled out more papers from his jacket, documents this time. After she died, I hired a private investigator. It took months, but we finally tracked down Walter Miller from Cedar Falls, Iowa. But when we found him, he had been dead for 4 years already. 5 years, Dorothy corrected quietly. He died 5 years ago. I'm sorry, David said. I'm so sorry I never got to meet him. I'm sorry I never got to ask him questions, or hear his voice, or know what kind of man he was. The room fell silent. Dorothy wiped her tears and looked at this man. This son Walter never knew he had. This living, breathing result of one terrible mistake on one terrible night. Why come here now? Dorothy finally asked. What do you want from me? David's eyes filled with tears. I just wanted to know him, even if it's just through stories. I wanted to know if he was a good man, if he was worth the sacrifice my mother made to protect him, if he would have wanted me. Dorothy felt something crack inside her heart. This man, this stranger, was asking the same questions Dorothy had been asking herself since she opened the sewing box. Who was Walter Miller, really? Was he a good man? Did he deserve to be remembered with love, despite his secrets? He was a good man, Dorothy heard herself say. Not perfect, not even close, but good. David's face lit up with relief and gratitude. Can you tell me about him? Please? And so Dorothy did. For the next hour, she told David stories about Walter, about how he could fix anything, about how he made terrible jokes that nobody laughed at except him, about how he cried when Susan was born and said she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Margaret added her own stories too. Stories about young Walter, about his dreams and his kindness and his bravery. And as they talked, something strange happened. Dorothy began to see Walter not as the husband who had betrayed her, but as a complete human being. A man who made mistakes. A man who carried pain. A man who tried his best to do right, even when he failed. But then David said something that made Dorothy's blood run cold. There's one more thing, David said hesitantly. Something my mother told me in her letter. Something about why that night happened in the first place. What do you mean? Dorothy asked. David pulled out his mother's letter and read from it. Walter told me something that night in the break room. He said he was drowning. He said he felt like he was living the wrong life. He said that 5 years earlier, he'd lost a son, a baby who died, and he'd never properly grieved because he'd buried the pain so deep. Margaret gasped. Thomas! He was talking about Thomas. Yes, David said, but there's more. My mother wrote, Walter said that ever since his baby died, he'd been going through the motions of living. He loved his wife, but he felt numb. He loved his daughter, but he felt guilty that she was alive when his first child was dead. He said he didn't know how to feel joy anymore. He said he was broken. Dorothy felt like the ground was opening up beneath her. All those years of marriage, had Walter been going through the motions? Had he been pretending to be happy while secretly drowning in grief for a son Dorothy never knew existed? My mother said Walter was desperate that night, David continued. He said he'd spent 5 years trying to be the perfect husband, the perfect father, the perfect son taking care of his widowed mother. But inside, he was falling apart. And that night, he just broke. David looked at Dorothy with tears in his eyes. Mrs. Miller, I'm not here to excuse what my father did. What he and my mother did was wrong. But I think he was suffering more than anyone knew. Dorothy stood up abruptly. She couldn't sit anymore. She walked to the window and stared out at the bird feeder in her backyard. A cardinal was there again. The same one from this morning, or maybe a different one. She couldn't tell. Dorothy? Margaret said softly behind her. Are you okay? Dorothy laughed, a harsh, broken sound. Am I okay? I just found out my husband had a dead son I never knew about, wrote love letters to his ex-girlfriend for 14 years, and had another son from a one-night stand. So no, Margaret, I'm not okay. I understand, Margaret said. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now. Dorothy spun around. Can't you? Your husband is dead too. Did he have secrets you never knew about? Did you spend your whole marriage thinking you knew someone, only to find out after they died that they were a complete stranger? Margaret's face fell. She looked down at her hands. Actually, yes. Dorothy froze. What? Margaret took a shaky breath. Robert, my husband, he had secrets too. After he died, I found out he'd been gambling for 20 years. He lost almost all our savings. He'd taken out loans I never knew about. He left me with debts that took me 2 years to pay off. Dorothy felt her anger deflate slightly. I didn't know. How could you? Margaret said. We just met today. But Dorothy, what I'm trying to say is, everyone has secrets. Everyone has parts of themselves they hide, even from the people they love most. It doesn't mean they didn't love us. It just means they were human. But Walter's secrets changed everything, Dorothy said desperately. They changed how I remember our marriage. They changed who I thought he was. No, David said, standing up. I'm sorry, Mrs. Miller, but I have to disagree. My mother's letter had one more thing in it. One more thing she wanted me to know. He held up the letter and read, After that night with Walter, I saw something in him. I saw regret. Real, genuine regret. He came to me the next day and apologized with tears in his eyes. He said he was going to fix his life. He was going to get help. He was going to be the man his wife and daughter deserved. David looked up at Dorothy. My mother wrote that she followed Walter's career from afar over the years. She read about him in the local newspaper when he got promoted at the factory. She saw him once at a grocery store with you and your daughter, and she said he looked happy. Really happy. She said it made her feel like her sacrifice, keeping me a secret, had been worth it. She sacrificed getting child support, Dorothy said quietly. She sacrificed having my husband know about his son. Why? Because she believed he deserved a chance to be happy, David said. Because she thought one mistake shouldn't define his entire life. And because she saw that he was trying to be better. Dorothy felt tears streaming down her face again. Did he? Did he get better? Margaret stood up and walked over to Dorothy. She took Dorothy's hands in hers. Dorothy, I never saw Walter after 1964. But from everything you've told me today about your marriage, about the man he became, I think yes. I think he did get better. But he never told me, Dorothy whispered, about Thomas, about that night with Patricia, about the pain he was carrying. Would you have understood if he had? Margaret asked gently. Would a young Dorothy in her 20s have been able to handle all of that? Dorothy thought about it. She thought about who she was in her 20s and 30s, young, naive, focused on raising Susan and keeping the household running. Would she have been able to support Walter through that kind of pain? Or would she have felt threatened and scared and angry? She honestly didn't know. Walter protected you, Margaret said. He carried his pain alone, so you wouldn't have to carry it with him. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe he should have trusted you. But Dorothy, he loved you. The letters prove it. He stopped writing to me because he chose you. He became a better man because of you. Dorothy looked at Margaret, then at David. Two people connected to Walter in ways she never knew existed. And suddenly, she realized something. The sewing box, she said. Walter planned all of this. He knew that after he died, we would all meet. He knew we would share our stories. He knew... She stopped mid-sentence. A terrible thought occurred to her. Margaret, Dorothy said urgently. You said the lawyer gave you the sewing box 2 months ago, and he told you to wait until today to bring it to me. Why today specifically? Did Walter's instructions say why it had to be today? Margaret's face went pale. Oh my God, I didn't even think about it. The lawyer said, he said today was important. He said Walter's instructions were very specific, that it had to be December 3rd. December 3rd, Dorothy repeated. That's today. But why is today? And then she remembered. Her heart stopped. Today is Susan's birthday, she whispered. December 3rd. Susan turns 56 years old today. David looked confused. Your daughter? What does she have to do with this? But Dorothy was already moving toward the phone. I need to call her, right now. She picked up the phone and dialed Susan's number with shaking hands. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Hello? Susan's voice came through the phone. Susan, honey, where are you? Dorothy asked urgently. I'm driving, Mom. I'm about 2 hours away from Cedar Falls. I wanted to surprise you for my birthday. I took a few days off work and... Susan, Dorothy interrupted. Did you receive anything in the mail recently? Any packages or letters? There was a pause. How did you know? I got a package yesterday from a lawyer's office. I haven't opened it yet. It says I'm supposed to open it today at... There was a rustling sound as Susan checked the package. At exactly 3 p.m. Mom, what's going on? Dorothy looked at the clock on the wall. It was 2:47 p.m. Susan, Dorothy said, her voice shaking. I need you to pull over right now and open that package. Your father sent it to you before he died. What? Mom, you're scaring me. Just do it, honey, please, and stay on the phone with me. Dorothy heard the sound of a car pulling over. She heard Susan's breathing, quick and nervous. Okay, I'm opening it, Susan said. There was silence on the phone. Then Dorothy heard Susan gasp. Mom! Susan's voice was barely a whisper. There's a letter here, and a birth certificate. Mom, this doesn't make sense. This birth certificate has Dad's name on it. But it's not mine. It's for a baby named David Miller, born May 15th, 1972. Dorothy's legs gave out. She sank into Walter's chair. Susan, Dorothy said carefully, you need to get here as fast as you can. There's someone you need to meet. Who? Susan asked, her voice rising with panic. Mom, what is this birth certificate? Who is David Miller? Dorothy looked at David, who was staring at her with wide, shocked eyes. He's your half-brother, Dorothy said, and your father wanted you to find out on your birthday. He wanted you to know you're not an only child. The phone went silent. Then Susan's voice came back, small and broken. I have a brother? Yes, Dorothy said. "And Susan, there's more, so much more. Just get here safely, okay?" "I'm coming," Susan said. "I'm coming right now." The line went dead. Dorothy set the phone down and looked at Margaret and David. Her whole body was shaking. "He planned this," Dorothy said. "Walter planned for all of us to find out on the same day. He wanted us all to be together when the truth came out." "But why?" David asked. "Why would he do this?" Margaret's eyes widened with realization. "Because he wanted to give you a family, David. He couldn't give it to you while he was alive, but he could give it to you after he died." Dorothy felt something shift inside her. Walter had orchestrated this entire day. He had planned for her to discover his secrets, yes. But he had also planned for her to meet Margaret, to meet David, to understand the full truth before Susan arrived. He had wanted them all to be together, to become a family, the family he could never give them while he was alive. But there was still one question nobody had answered. "Margaret," Dorothy said slowly, "that first letter Walter wrote in 1971, the one where he said he couldn't stop thinking about you, that was right around the time he and Patricia—" Margaret nodded, understanding what Dorothy was asking. "You want to know if Walter turned to Patricia because he was still in love with me?" "Were you?" Dorothy asked. "Were you the reason he made that mistake?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Read the rest of the letters, Dorothy. Read all of them. I think you'll find the answer isn't what you expect." Dorothy looked at the stack of letters still sitting on the kitchen table. There were still a dozen letters she hadn't read yet. A dozen more secrets waiting to be discovered. And Susan would be here in 2 hours, expecting answers Dorothy wasn't sure she had. But before Dorothy could move toward the letters, there was a loud crash outside. The sound of metal hitting metal. All three of them ran to the front window. A car had crashed into the tree at the edge of Dorothy's front yard. Smoke was coming from the hood, and behind the wheel, slumped over and not moving, was a woman with gray hair. Dorothy's heart stopped. "That's Susan's car," she whispered. She ran toward the front door, but David was faster. He was already outside, running toward the crashed vehicle. Dorothy followed as fast as her old legs would carry her, Margaret right behind her. When they reached the car, David was already pulling the door open. "She's breathing," he called out. "But she's unconscious. Call 911. Margaret pulled out her phone and dialed. Dorothy dropped to her knees beside the car and took her daughter's hand. "Susan," she sobbed. "Susan, baby, wake up. Please wake up." But Susan didn't respond. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead. And in Susan's lap, scattered across the car seat, were dozens of letters that had spilled from the package she'd opened. Letters that Susan had been reading while she was driving. Letters that had distracted her just long enough to miss the turn into Dorothy's driveway. As the sound of sirens grew closer, Dorothy looked at David, this stranger who was her husband's son, who was now desperately checking Susan's pulse. "She's going to be okay," David said, though his voice was shaking. "She has to be okay." And in that moment, Dorothy realized something. She had spent the entire day learning about Walter's secrets and feeling betrayed. But Walter had given her something she never expected. He had given her a family, a bigger family than she knew she had. And now that family was in danger of falling apart before it ever truly came together. The ambulance arrived in 7 minutes, but to Dorothy, it felt like 7 hours. She held Susan's hand the entire time, whispering prayers and pleading with her daughter to wake up. David stayed by her side, one hand on Susan's wrist checking her pulse, the other holding the car door open. Margaret stood back, her own hands clasped in prayer, tears streaming down her face. When the paramedics arrived, they carefully lifted Susan onto a stretcher. The cut on her forehead wasn't deep, they said, but she had hit her head hard. They needed to take her to the hospital right away. "I'm coming with her," Dorothy said, trying to climb into the ambulance. "Ma'am, are you family?" one of the paramedics asked. "I'm her mother," Dorothy said firmly. "And I'm her brother," David added, stepping forward. The paramedic looked confused, but nodded. "One of you can ride with us." "You go," David said to Dorothy. "I'll follow in my car with Margaret." Dorothy climbed into the ambulance, and the doors closed. As they drove away, sirens blaring, Dorothy looked down at her daughter's pale face. "Please be okay," she whispered. "Please, Susan. I have so much to tell you." At the hospital, the doctors ran tests for 2 hours. Dorothy sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. David sat beside her, silent and worried. Margaret paced back and forth, unable to sit still. Finally, a doctor came out. "Mrs. Miller, your daughter is awake. She has a concussion and some bruising, but she's going to be fine. She's asking for you." Dorothy stood up so fast she felt dizzy. "Can I see her?" "Yes, but keep it calm. She needs rest." Dorothy hurried down the hallway, David and Margaret following close behind. When they reached Susan's room, Dorothy pushed the door open. Susan was sitting up in the hospital bed, a white bandage on her forehead. Her face was pale, but her eyes were open and alert. "Mom," Susan said, her voice weak. "I'm so sorry. I was reading those letters while I was driving, and I—" "Shh," Dorothy said, rushing to her daughter's side. She took Susan's hand and squeezed it tight. "Don't apologize. Just tell me you're okay." "I'm okay," Susan said. "But Mom, those letters, the ones Dad left for me, I read them. I read all of them." Dorothy's heart clenched. "What did they say?" Susan's eyes filled with tears. "He told me everything. About his first son who died. About the night he made a mistake. About the brother I never knew I had." She looked past Dorothy to where David stood in the doorway. "Is that him?" David stepped forward slowly, nervously. "Hi," he said quietly. "I'm David." Susan stared at him. Dorothy could see her daughter studying David's face, seeing Walter in every feature. "You look just like him," Susan whispered. "You look just like our dad." "So do you," David said with a small, sad smile. "You have his eyes." For a long moment, the two siblings just looked at each other, 56 years and 54 years old, meeting for the first time. Then Susan did something Dorothy didn't expect. She held out her hand. "It's nice to meet you, brother," Susan said. David's face crumpled. He took Susan's hand and held it tight. "It's nice to meet you too, sister." Dorothy felt tears streaming down her face as she watched her daughter and Walter's son hold hands. Margaret stood in the doorway, crying quietly, witnessing the family Walter had created finally coming together. Later that evening, after the doctors said Susan could go home, all four of them sat in Dorothy's living room. Susan was on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her. David sat beside her, still holding her hand like he was afraid she might disappear. Margaret sat in the wooden chair, and Dorothy sat in Walter's old armchair, the stack of unread letters on the table beside her. "I need to know everything," Susan said. "Dad's letter told me about David, but it said Mom would explain the rest. So please, Mom, tell me everything." And so Dorothy did. She told Susan about the mysterious sewing box, about Margaret and the love letters, about Thomas, the baby who died, about Patricia and the one terrible night, about Walter's pain and his secrets and his plan to bring them all together. When Dorothy finished, Susan was crying, but she wasn't angry. She looked relieved. "I always knew something was wrong," Susan said quietly. "When I was growing up, sometimes I'd catch Dad staring off into space with this look on his face, like he was somewhere else, like he was remembering something painful. I asked Mom about it once, and she said Dad was just tired from work." Dorothy felt a pang of guilt. She had noticed those moments too, but she had never pushed Walter to talk about them. She had just accepted his explanations and moved on. "I think Dad was always carrying this weight," Susan continued, "and he never wanted to put it on us. He wanted to protect us from his pain." "But that's not fair," David said quietly. "He shouldn't have had to carry it alone." "No," Margaret agreed. "He shouldn't have." But Walter was from a generation of men who thought showing pain was weakness. He thought being strong meant suffering in silence. Dorothy looked at the stack of letters on the table. There were still 12 she hadn't read. "There's more," Dorothy said. "Margaret told me to read all the letters. She said the answer to everything is in them." "Then let's read them together," Susan said. "All of us. Whatever secrets Dad had left, we should discover them as a family." Dorothy felt her heart swell. Family! Susan had called them a family. She picked up the stack of letters and handed them out. "Each of us will read 3 letters out loud," she said. "Let's see what Walter wanted us to know." Susan read first. The letter was dated May 1979, 8 years after Walter stopped writing regularly to Margaret. "Margaret, I know I said my last letter to you was in 1985, and it will be. But I'm writing this one now, in 1979, because something happened today that made me think of you. Susan asked me about death today. She's 7 years old, and she wanted to know if people we love stay with us after they die. I told her yes. I told her that love doesn't end just because someone is gone. And then I realized I was talking about Thomas, our son, the baby we lost. For 14 years, I've been trying to forget him, trying to bury the pain so deep that it can't hurt me anymore. But it never worked. The pain is always there. But today, when Susan asked that question, I realized something. I don't want to forget Thomas. He was real. He existed. He mattered. And forgetting him would be like saying he never mattered at all. So I'm going to do something I should have done years ago. I'm going to tell Dorothy about him. I'm going to tell her about you. I'm going to finally be honest about my past. I'm scared. I'm scared she'll leave me. I'm scared she'll think I never really loved her. But I can't keep lying anymore. Wish me luck, Margaret." "Walter." Susan finished reading and looked up at Dorothy. "Did he tell you, Mom? That night or any time after?" Dorothy's voice was hollow. "No, he never told me. He must have chickened out." Margaret shook her head. "Or something stopped him. Read the next letter." David picked up the next letter, dated May 1979, just 2 days after the previous one. "Margaret, I was going to tell Dorothy tonight. I had practiced what I would say. I had prepared myself for every possible reaction. But when I got home from work, Dorothy met me at the door with the biggest smile on her face. She was crying happy tears. And she said 4 words that changed everything. "Walter, I'm pregnant again." She's pregnant. At 34 years old, after the doctors said it probably wouldn't happen again, Dorothy is pregnant. She was so happy, so excited. She said she had been wanting to tell me for a week, but was waiting for the perfect moment. And tonight, she said, felt perfect. How could I tell her about my past in that moment? How could I tell her about Thomas and you and all my secrets when she was glowing with joy about this new baby? I couldn't. I just couldn't. So I held her and told her I was happy. And I was happy. I really was. But I also felt like a coward. I'll tell her someday, Margaret. I swear I will. Just not today. Walter, David finished reading and looked at Dorothy. "Were you pregnant again? Do I have another sibling?" Dorothy's face crumpled. "I miscarried 6 weeks later. The baby didn't make it." The room went silent. Susan reached over and took her mother's hand. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Susan whispered. "I never knew. Walter and I decided not to tell you," Dorothy said, wiping her tears. "You were only 7. We didn't want to burden you with our grief. So we suffered quietly, just the 2 of us." Margaret stood up and walked over to Dorothy. She knelt beside the chair and looked into Dorothy's eyes. "That's when Walter stopped writing the letters, isn't it? That's when he finally let go of the past." Dorothy nodded. "After the miscarriage, Walter changed. He became more present, more focused on me and Susan. It was like he realized life was too short to live in the past. Because he almost lost everything, Margaret said. "He almost told you his secrets and risked losing you. And then he actually lost the baby." It scared him into appreciating what he had. Dorothy picked up the next letter with shaking hands. This one was dated December 1979, 7 months after the miscarriage. "Margaret, I'm writing this letter knowing it will truly be my last one to you." Dorothy and I buried our grief together. We cried together. We held each other through the darkest nights. And through that pain, I discovered something I had been too blind to see. Dorothy is the strongest person I know. She's the bravest. She's the most loving. And she's been carrying me through life for 11 years, without me even realizing it. I wanted to tell her about you and Thomas. I wanted to confess everything, but then I realized something. Confessing would have made me feel better, but it would have hurt her. And I've hurt her enough by not being fully present all these years. So instead of confessing, I'm making a different choice. I'm choosing to let go. I'm choosing to be the husband she deserves. I'm choosing to live in the present instead of the past. I'm locking these letters away in my mother's sewing box. I'll never read them again, but I can't destroy them either, because they're part of my story. They're proof that I was broken once and that I healed. Someday, many years from now when I'm gone, maybe Dorothy will find these letters. And maybe she'll understand that even though I wasn't perfect, even though I carried pain and made mistakes, I loved her with everything I had. Goodbye, Margaret. Thank you for being part of my story. Walter. Dorothy finished reading, and the room fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. They all just sat there, processing everything they had learned. Finally, Susan broke the silence. "He loved you, Mom. Despite everything, he really loved you." "I know," Dorothy whispered. "I know he did." "But there are still more letters," David said, pointing to the remaining ones on the table. "Why are there letters after 1979, if that was supposed to be his last one?" Margaret picked up one of the remaining letters and looked at the date. Her face went pale. "These aren't from 1979, she said. "These are from 2019, just months before Walter died." Dorothy felt her heart stop. "What?" "Let me see." Margaret handed her the letter. The date at the top read November 2019. Dorothy opened it with shaking hands and began to read aloud. "To my family, if you're reading this, then my plan worked." Dorothy found the sewing box. She met Margaret. She met David. And Susan discovered she has a brother. "I know this day has been painful. I know you've learned things about me that have shaken your understanding of who I was. But please, keep reading, because there's one more truth I need you to know. Last year, I was diagnosed with heart disease. The doctors said I had maybe a year left, maybe 2 if I was lucky. When I heard that news, I realized something. I was going to die with secrets, and those secrets were going to hurt the people I loved most. So I made a plan. I hired a lawyer. I found Margaret through old factory records. I discovered Patricia had passed away, but she had a son named David who was searching for me. I brought all the pieces together because I wanted you all to know each other. I wanted Susan to have a brother. I wanted Dorothy to understand my past. I wanted David to finally know his father's story. And I wanted Margaret to know that I forgave her for something she never needed forgiveness for. But most of all, I wanted to leave you all with a family. Not a perfect family, not a family without pain, but a real family, connected by love and truth and understanding. I know Dorothy must be angry with me right now. I know Susan must be confused. I know David must have so many questions. But I also know this. If you're all together reading this letter, then you've already started to become what I always wanted you to be. A family that knows the truth and loves anyway. Walter. Dorothy finished reading and looked up at the 3 people in her living room. Margaret, who Walter had loved in his youth. David, who Walter never knew existed. And Susan, who Walter had raised and loved for 56 years. They were all connected by one imperfect man who had made mistakes and carried pain, but had loved them all in his own complicated way. "There's one more letter," Margaret said quietly. It's addressed to you specifically, Dorothy." She handed Dorothy the final envelope. Dorothy's hands shook as she opened it. "My dearest Dorothy, by now you know everything, and you probably hate me. I don't blame you. I kept secrets. I wrote letters to another woman. I had a son I never knew about. I lost a son I never told you about. I was a coward. I was a fool. I was broken. But Dorothy, I need you to know one thing, one truth that matters more than all the others. You saved me. When I met you in 1967, I was drowning in grief and regret. I was going through the motions of life without really living, but you saw something in me worth loving. You saw past my sadness to the man I could become, and slowly, over 53 years, you helped me become that man. Every time you smiled at me, you healed a little piece of my broken heart. Every time you believed in me, you made me want to be better. Every time you loved me, you proved that I was worth loving. Those letters I wrote to Margaret, they weren't about love. They were about pain I didn't know how to process. And I stopped writing them because you taught me how to live in the present instead of the past. That mistake with Patricia, it happened because I was broken and drowning, but I never made another mistake like that again because you showed me what real love looked like. And when we lost our baby in 1979, you held my hand through that grief. You let me cry. You let me be weak, and you stayed. Dorothy, you were my home. My safe place, my peace. I should have told you all of this while I was alive. I should have trusted you with my pain, but I was too scared, too proud, too stupid. So I'm telling you now, thank you for 53 years of patience and love. Thank you for raising Susan to be strong and kind. Thank you for being the best thing that ever happened to me. And please, please forgive me for the secrets I kept. Not because I deserve forgiveness, but because I can't rest peacefully knowing I hurt you. I love you, Dorothy. I always have. I always will. Forever yours, Walter." Dorothy finished reading, and the tears came. Not angry tears this time. Not betrayed tears. Just sad, healing tears for a love that had been complicated and imperfect, but real. She folded the letter carefully and looked up at the family Walter had given her. "He was right," Dorothy said quietly. "I was angry. I felt betrayed. But now, after reading all of this, after meeting all of you, I understand." "Understand what?" Susan asked gently. "That Walter was human," Dorothy said. "He wasn't the perfect husband I thought he was. But he wasn't a villain either. He was just a man who carried pain and tried his best to love through it." She looked at Margaret. "Thank you for bringing these letters to me, and thank you for sharing your stories about him." Then she looked at David. "Thank you for searching for your father, even though he was already gone. Thank you for wanting to know him." And finally, she looked at Susan. "And thank you, sweetheart, for calling us a family, because that's what Walter wanted. That's what he planned for." Susan stood up slowly, still dizzy from her concussion, and walked over to Dorothy. She wrapped her arms around her mother. "I love you, Mom," Susan said, "and I forgive Dad, for all of it." David stood up too and walked over to them. Hesitantly, he put his hand on Susan's shoulder. May I join?" Susan pulled him into the hug. "You're my brother. Of course you can." Margaret stayed in her chair, watching the three of them embrace. Dorothy looked over at her and held out her hand. "You too, Margaret. You're part of this family too." Margaret's face crumpled, and she joined the hug. The four of them stood there in Dorothy's living room, holding each other, crying together, healing together. Outside, the sun was setting. The cardinal had returned to the bird feeder one last time before night fell. And Dorothy, for the first time since Walter died 5 years ago, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. 3 months later, Dorothy stood in her backyard with Susan, David, and Margaret. They had come together to plant a tree, a cherry tree with beautiful white blossoms. Underneath it, they placed a small stone marker, in memory of Thomas Miller, born and died 1961, forever loved, never forgotten. "Do you think Dad would have liked this?" Susan asked. I think he would have loved it, Dorothy said. He always wanted Thomas to be remembered. David knelt down and placed a hand on the stone. I wish I could have met my brother. Me too, Susan said, kneeling beside him. But at least we have each other now. The four of them stood in silence for a moment, honoring the baby who had died 63 years ago and the man who had never stopped grieving for him. Then Dorothy turned to look at her family, her expanded, complicated, beautiful family. Walter's sewing box contained secrets, Dorothy said, but it also contained truth, and that truth brought us all together. Should we keep it? Susan asked. The sewing box, I mean? Dorothy thought about it. Then she shook her head. No, the box did its job. It revealed the truth, but we don't need to keep looking backward anymore. Walter wouldn't want that. So what should we do with it? David asked. Dorothy smiled. We'll pass it on to the next generation, to your children and grandchildren, not as a box of secrets, but as a reminder that everyone has a story, everyone carries pain, and everyone deserves to be understood. Margaret put her arm around Dorothy. Walter would be proud of you. I hope so, Dorothy said, because I forgive him. For all of it. I forgive him and I still love him. As the four of them walked back toward the house, Dorothy looked up at the sky. The evening stars were starting to appear. Goodbye, Walter, she whispered. Thank you for the truth. Thank you for the family. And thank you for 53 imperfect, beautiful years. And for the first time since opening the sewing box, Dorothy felt like she could finally move forward. Not by forgetting the past, but by understanding it. Not by pretending Walter was perfect, but by accepting that he was human. And not by staying angry, but by choosing to forgive. Because that's what love does. It forgives, it heals, it endures. Even after death, even after secrets, even after pain, love endures. And Dorothy, at 81 years old, finally understood what Walter had been trying to teach her all along. That a life lived with love, even imperfect love, is a life worth celebrating. Dorothy never opened Walter's sewing box again, but she kept it on a shelf in her living room where she could see it every day. A reminder not of secrets and lies, but of truth and family. A reminder that sometimes the things we're most afraid to discover are the very things that set us free.